Welcome to JOHS Literacy Bites, where every teacher can become a literacy teacher in slightly more than 5 minutes. Today's topic, Rubrics Part 2, Defining Performance Levels and Weighing Point Values. All right, so welcome back to our second microlearning session on rubrics. By the end of this session, you should have everything you need to create your own rubrics for assignments in your classroom. And if you've already been making your own rubrics for a long time, hopefully you'll still see some different ideas and techniques that you'd like to try. But first, as always, let's review last week's learning. We learned that rubrics help teachers be more efficient, consistent, and transparent when grading and setting expectations for student work. We learned once you've developed your writing prompt, you can disaggregate the grading by breaking down the overall scoring into smaller, distinct components, or in other words, establishing multiple scoring criteria for your rubric. Finally, we learned to use targeted adjectives to define descriptors of excellence for each scoring criterion. Let's go back and check in on our health science teacher from last week. She started by creating a writing prompt. In this case, the prompt essentially was to design and write a pamphlet to help people learn about a specific health issue. She then established disaggregated scoring criteria to assess the student's work. You can see the 4 criteria she came up with here. She then wrote down descriptors of excellence for each criterion. But we still have 2 more steps before this rubric is finished. Today, we'll work on defining the performance levels within the rubric. And we'll also work on weighing the point values for each grading criterion. So let's talk about what we mean by a performance level. As discussed here, performance levels refer to the distinct categories or tiers used to evaluate the quality of a student's work. You'll also sometimes see these referred to as levels of proficiency or levels of mastery. Let's look back at where we left off with this rubric. Please pause the video to discuss with your colleagues how would you establish performance levels to finish this rubric, and in that discussion include how many performance levels you would include and what labels you would use to describe each level. All right, so there are a lot of different ways that you can establish performance levels when creating a rubric. Some methods are more straightforward and others are a little bit more technical, but that doesn't mean that one style of rubric is better than the other. It all depends on factors like the components of the assignment the rubric is designed to assess, how students might use the rubric to set expectations and get feedback on their work, and your individual preferences as a teacher. I've listed 4 popular styles of rubrics here: the checklist plus, the ladder, and the guidebook. As we discuss these, think about which styles you've seen and used before and which are new to you but could still be useful in your class. The first is the checklist rubric. This rubric is about as straightforward as it gets. Either the criteria is evident within the student work or it's not. I like this style of rubric when your criteria are very black and white. Checklist rubrics are also easy for students to understand, and they can be especially useful when reviewed before it's time for students to turn in their work. The Checklist Plus rubric is basically just like the checklist, but allows opportunity for partial credit. Personally, I think this one works better for most writing assignments that you would give in your class, as it allows for some gray area. Next up is the ladder rubric. The ladder rubric was a favorite of mine when I taught language arts because it allowed for greater differentiation and levels of proficiency. And you can tie those levels back to your course standards, your learning objective, or descriptors of excellence. One thing to note with a ladder rubric is that you'll need to think about how you can give additional feedback to your students. This student, for example, might need help understanding how he was approaching in criteria 1. To do this, you can always have a whole class conversation after an assignment is passed back where you discuss both positive and negative trends in student work and show examples using an overhead projector. Students can then compare their own work to the models and self-reflect on the degree to which those trends are evident in their own work as well. You can also supplement this rubric with a little bit of written feedback, such as specifically identifying one area of strength in the student's work and one opportunity for growth. The last rubric you'll see here is what you'll typically find in professionally made curriculum resources. We're going to call it the guidebook rubric because each and every level of proficiency for each criteria comes with its own descriptor. Now, these can be time-consuming to make, but they can also make grading that much less subjective. In addition to giving students more detailed feedback when you pass back the graded rubrics and facilitate student reflection. Right, we're almost finished making our rubric. Our last step is going to be weighing and assigning the point values for the grading criteria. A few factors to consider when assigning point values are the importance of the criteria in relation to the learning objective or content standard. For example, in this assignment, criteria 1, showing understanding of content, is probably more important than the student's grammar, mechanics, and style. You can also consider the complexity and effort required within the task in order to meet the criteria, how much time students have spent on the different criteria during class, and if your grading system uses total points logic where some assignments can be worth more than 100 points, or if you structure your gradebook so that all summative assessments are worth exactly 100 points. So for this teacher's ladder style rubric, let's assume that she makes all of her assignments worth 100 points. You then just want to make sure that you weigh the points in a way that they all add up to 100. Notice how the two most heavily weighed categories here are understanding of content and use of citations and evidence. There, you'll then assign a percentage of available points for each level of proficiency. I like to make the bottom level 50% of total points available and leave 0% for work that is unsubmitted or plagiarized. In a grading system like the one in MMPS, I think it makes sense to go down in increments of 10% to align with how our grading scale goes down in increments of 10, with grades in the 90s or 100 being an A, grades in the 80s being a B, and so on. Just to note, sometimes you'll end up with the proficiency level not being worth a whole number of points. And that's no big deal, as Schoology does allow you to use decimals when entering grades and making rubrics. After all is said and done, this student would have received an 82 on this assignment. They probably would have made a beautiful, well-organized pamphlet for their health science class, but they still struggled with citing evidence in the manner required in the assignment's directions. Okay, so before we wrap things up, I do have one more resource for you. I made this general standards-based grading rubric that should be able to be used with any class or any assignment. It's a ladder style rubric, but it also provides an explanation for what is meant by each level of proficiency, along with alignment with a traditional percentage scale score, a formative score, a letter grade, and a Cambridge ACE exam score. The only thing that you would need to do is create a descriptor of excellence for each criteria, but otherwise, this rubric will be ready to go for whatever constructive response assignment you're having your students do. I'm going to leave copies of this in every Academy office next to the mailboxes, so grab one and let me know if you have questions or if you need support with using a rubric like this with your students. To summarize what we learned today, teachers have options when deciding how to define performance levels within their rubrics. Some styles include the checklist plus, the ladder, and the guidebook. Make sure to weigh the point values of different criteria within your rubric and assign a percentage of possible points for each performance level. And that's all for Rubrics Part 2. Please stay tuned for Rubrics Part 3 coming next week, where we'll talk about how to create rubrics using the rubric tool in Schoology. But before you go, as a bridge to practice, please discuss these questions with your colleagues. Which of your upcoming assignments could benefit from being assessed with the rubric? Which style of rubric makes sense for that assignment? The checklist plus, the ladder, the guidebook, or maybe even something else? And finally, how many criteria will be used in assessing that assignment? And how will you assign point values? All right, thank you everybody.